Hi, welcome to Plain is Simple. Today we'll be teaching you how to animate a jump. We'll start with the key poses. There are 6 main key poses in character animation, and these are: first, the starting pose. This is the pose we start with. Second is the anticipation pose, which is most of the time, but not always, the opposite of the action. So a jump is going up, so the anticipation is going down. Third is the action pose, which in this case is the jump itself. Fourth is the overshoot pose. This goes a little bit further than the settle pose. So if this is our target where we land, then this is the overshoot. As you can see, it's a little bit over. Then the recoil pose, this goes a little bit backwards compared to the settle pose. So if this is our target landing point, then this is the recoil. As you can see, it's a little bit backwards. Sixth is the settle pose, and this is the pose that we end up with. So let's set the timing for each key poses. Even with just the key poses, we could already see the character moving. Now let's do the in-betweens. Let's create a simplified guide for the spacing. So the longer sticks would represent the key poses, and as we do the in-betweens, they'll be represented with shorter sticks. Let's label our key poses. And let's color code our key poses in the timeline using the blue color. And as we do the in-betweens, we will color it red. So blue are key poses, red are in-betweens. So what would be the easing from the starting pose to the anticipation pose? So let's recap easing and the halves method. We have discussed this in detail in our members-only lessons, and you can become a member to access those lessons, but we'll give you a quick overview right now. So let's say we have these 2 key poses, and this is the timing. If we start the in-betweens at the second frame and get the half of that, and repeat the process moving forward, getting the half of the next frame, and then the half after that, and so on, we'll get an easing in, or easing into frame, meaning the spacing is getting smaller and smaller, so it's decelerating. Now, if we have the same 2 key poses, and we start off at the end, and get the half, and then repeat the process, but this time going in backwards, then we'll get an easing out, or easing out of frame, meaning the spacing is getting bigger and bigger, thus it's accelerating. Now can we combine the 2? So let's use the same key poses but double the timing, because we're like fitting 2 easing into 1, right? So now to combine, we need to start at the middle and get the half of the first and last frames. Now we can either do the left side first, in which we'll animate backwards from the middle, thus easing out, or we can do the right side first, in which we'll animate forwards from the middle, thus easing in. Let's do the left side first. And then let's do the right side. So this is what you call easing out in. In other words, it would accelerate and then decelerate, or easing out and then easing in. This is the most natural looking easing by default. If in doubt, just use easing out in and you'll have a decent animation. Now let's go back to the jump. What easing would we use from the starting pose to the anticipation pose? Naturally, we would think to use easing out in. And while that may be correct, easing out in would take a big amount of timing, thus making our animation a bit slow. So instead, we can decide between easing out or easing in. But which parts would we want to focus? Is it this part or this part? So I want to focus on the anticipation, so let's do easing in. So let's start directly after the starting pose and get the half of the starting and the anticipation. Then let's animate forwards. Let's go to the next frame and get the half of the previous frame and the anticipation. And let's go to the next frame and get the half of the previews and the anticipation. Before we proceed, let me explain the spacing guide a bit. So this is a simplified guide that represents the spacing. Take note that this is not the timing. The timing is the timeline. The spacing guide represents the spacing of our animation. So this spacing in our guide represents this in our animation. In our guide, the spacing gets smaller and smaller, just like in our animation, the spacing also gets smaller and smaller. So if in our guide, the in-between is placed at the middle, then in our animation, it's also placed at the middle. Okay, now let's go back to our animation and let's have a look at what we have so far. How about from anticipation pose to the action pose? Again, which part do you want to focus on? This or this? I actually want to focus on both. We already have the initial slowness of the anticipation on this side, and I want to follow that up on the other side as well. But at the same time, we also need slowness on the action side so that there would be a hang time. So let's do an easing out in. Let's start at the middle, get the half. From the middle, let's animate backwards. And then let's go back again to the middle, and now let's animate forwards. And we have an easing out in. You may have noticed that the easing out doesn't have equal number of frames as the easing in. So easing out in doesn't really need to be equal on both sides. So in this case, which side would you want to have more frames? This would again go back to the question, which would you want to emphasize more? So I would like to emphasize the action more so that we can feel the gravity, the hang time. Thus, we have more frames on easing in than easing out. Let's have a look. You may have noticed that the jump is a bit weird. Why is that? That's because we have the knees bent throughout from anticipation to action. In reality, we'll have our knees straighten up first before we'll have the momentum to push our body up into the air. Because our foot wouldn't float, right? Our knees would not stay bent, but would straighten. But how can we animate that? We did follow the halves method, right? So what is lacking is the breakdown. A breakdown is a special kind of in-between. It's a kind of in-between that would direct the other in-betweens in a certain way. Without the breakdown, and if we'll just strictly do the halves method, right, we're going to get the half of this, half of this, half of this, half, half, and half. Then as you can see, with that rule, the knees would always be bent. There's no way for us to draw an in-between with the legs straighten up. So let's try again. But let's do the breakdown first. Let's estimate when that last point of contact would happen. So it's probably here where we'll have the knees straighten up. Because of the breakdown, how we'll divide this into two have changed. Before, this is our planned middle. And from here, we're supposed to do easing out and then easing in. And this was the planned distribution of frames. Now, because of the breakdown, the distribution of frames has changed. We'll still do an easing out in, but the easing out has been shortened with only one in between. And the easing in has more frames. Let's do the easing out first. From the breakdown, let's animate backwards. So it would be the in-between of the anticipation and the breakdown. Let's get the half of this. Now, from breakdown to action, let's do easing in. So from the breakdown, we'll be animating forwards using the halves method. So half, 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 and half. Let's take a look at the preview. Now, from action to overshoot, what would be the easing? If we consider the physics, then it would be easing out. It can't be easing out in because the character can't physically slow down because of the pull of the gravity. And again, we need a breakdown. If there's no breakdown, it's going to look like this. If you jump like this in real life and you don't straighten your legs when you land, then that's going to be painful. In reality, it's our instinct to straighten our legs and then bend it after, like a spring. So you need this pose to soften the impact of the jump. So another way to think about this is that a breakdown is a way to tell our future self that this needs to straighten before it would bend again. So that when we do the halves method, this is now accounted for. So we have placed the breakdown at the end and not at the middle because our plan was easing out and not easing out in. Now let's do the halves method animating backwards. So let's get the half, 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 and half. Let's have a look. So what's the easing from overshoot to recoil? We can use the default easing, which is easing out in. Let's go to the middle and get the half of this. From the middle, let's do easing out first. Let's animate backwards using the halves method. And let's go back to the middle and let's animate using the halves method moving forwards. Let's have a look. Only one segment left. So what would be the easing from the recoil pose to the settle pose? Again, we can use easing out in here, but we lack the frames to convey easing out in with only using the halves method. With our timing, we can only add 2 more in-betweens. So again, we need to decide whether to use easing out or easing in. So let's take a look at our spacing guide. Since we already have slowness in this area, and if we do an easing out, it's going to make this part very slow and the end part a bit abrupt. And we don't want the ending to be abrupt. So let's do an easing in so that the slowness would be well distributed and the ending would be smooth. So let's do that. Let's get the half of the recoil pose and the settle pose. Let's go to the next frame and get the half of the previous frame and the settle pose. And let's have a look. Next, let's add smears to the fast parts of the animation. So take a look at these frames. The spacing from this frame and its previous frame is a bit big, so it's fast. So let's add smears. And let's apply this concept to all of the fast parts or the ones with big spacing in our animation. So we're done. Let's have a look. We decided to experiment further and add background to this using Blender and After Effects. And here are 3 options. I like the last one best, so let's use that one. The color of the character is not matching the background, so let's use After Effects to blend the color of the character. Finally, let's add glow. So here's the result. I know we only skimmed through some concepts like the halves method or easing. So if you want to learn the concepts in more detail, if you want lessons that cover the basics that will teach you frame-by-frame animation from scratch, then you might want to consider becoming a member of our channel. We have a lot of lessons on our lesson library that are geared towards beginners. You learn timing and spacing, the straight ahead method, pose to pose, how to in between, the halves method, how to favor, easing, how to add smears, and a lot more drills to practice on. If you're interested, you can click this link.